We'll be reviewing the use of Custom Data Designer to create entirely new items within Apollo. On the design screen, hit the Create New button. You'll see the Design Business Requirements screen pop up. Our first required field is the requirement name. This is the business question that you're trying to answer. I'll pretend that I have a clothing site with virtual try-on tools, and I'll ask the question, which virtual try-on tools were used most frequently? I also have the description field, which will make it into some of the documentation for this question. So I can add some additional text to clarify this further. Then I see a blank event attribute data source and variables section here. This I'll fill out later after I fill out the rest of the required fields. Site features relate to the type of location on the site that it relates to. So we have already chosen a bunch of categories here, so it's not possible to add to them, but this falls most closely into the tools section. And you can just select the site feature that matches your feature most closely. There may or may not be something exactly analogous. Site vertical is an optional field. If this is very specific to a particular industry, then you can select something from the vertical menu. You also have the report type menu. This is how the item translates into Analysis Workspace if you use some of the dashboarding features in Apollo later. Typically, a flow would be used for something like a prop where you want to see a progression of values over time, and a freeform table would be used for most everything else. And the vast majority of the time, we'll select freeform table. We then have the scope menu at the bottom, which is very important. In most cases, you'll just see property or organization in your scope menu. Choosing the property level allows this new item that I'm creating to be available just for this property in Apollo, but not for other properties under the same organization. Choosing organization allows me to access this item in new properties that I create, as well as other properties that already exist under this organization. And for those of you that have the higher level permissions than organization, it works similarly. For example, if I'm an agency partner and I choose this at the agency level, all organizations within the agency and all properties within those organizations could potentially access the item that I'm creating. So I'll choose organization level for now, and then I'll hit save and continue. Then I'll get this add event attribute to business requirements screen. And event attributes are combinations of events with attributes. So if I'm creating a new top level event, or if I'm adding an attribute that doesn't exist, then I'll need to hit the create new button. Most of the time when you're creating a new requirement, at least one of those things is true. In this example, we're creating a completely new event in terms of a data layer push and an EVAR and an event to track that item. So I'll go ahead and hit create new, and I'm not selecting an existing event. I'm creating a new event for virtual try-on tool use. So I'll hit create new, and I'll call this virtual try-on tool used. And I can use a similar description before that I used before. Then I have all of the details for this event. So I have my beacon settings in terms of whether I want it to be an s.t or an f.tl call. And these settings are related to Adobe Analytics implementation. So if you're not familiar with Adobe Analytics implementation, we suggest that you get help from an experienced architect to make these decisions. And the s.tl call, this is going to be the one here that we want to use. We don't want this to trigger a new page view. And then whether or not we want to clear variables. And this, again, is an architectural decision. So if you're not familiar with these settings, work with an experienced architect. but in this case, we'll choose do not clear variables. Then we have some options at the bottom to exclude from the tag manager, the data destination, or the data layer documentation. And in this case, we do want everything in all of these. For the most part, you'll leave these unchecked. But if you wouldn't like to see an item in the data layer documentation or have it in GitHub, you could exclude it here. The data destination is the Adobe Analytics variable configuration. If you didn't want Apollo to automatically perform that in the admin console, you could exclude this. And if you didn't want it to make it to launch, you could exclude it from launch by hitting exclude from tag manager. Most of the time, you'll want it to go everywhere to keep your documentation and your instance in sync. So we'll hit a save and continue. So I've created this new event, and this is the only top level event that I need to create. So I'll hit save and continue again. Then I have all of the existing attributes that I could add to this event. And attributes will just be aspects that we want to track about the event. It could be the fact that it occurred. It could also be more specific details, in this case, the name of the virtual try-on tool. So we'll want to create a count of virtual try-on tool uses and a name of the virtual try-on tool attribute. So here I'll create new, and we'll start with the count. So we'll say count of virtual try-on tool uses. And this description, we can say increments each time the tools are used. And by default, this is at the same level. It's at the organization level, just like the item that I previously created. So this will default to the same level as your overall business requirement. And generally, that's what you want. So we'll hit save and continue. And then we need an additional attribute for the name of the virtual try-on tool. Now we've created the two new attributes off of this event, and we'll hit save and continue. And I'll get a verification that I want to save these new attributes, and I'll go ahead and save them. And I'm done adding attributes, so I can hit continue and continue again. And now I'm back at my main screen. So we have the virtual try-on tool used event in purple. This is going to be our data layer push. Then we have the attributes about this, which are going to ultimately map to an event in Adobe Analytics and an EVAR in Adobe Analytics. And in order to get there, we need to next add a data source. The data source is typically a data layer value, but it can also come from a number of other options. So we'll hit add data source next to the count of virtual try-on tool uses. And there's already a number of items here. And for anything that is simply an event that increments, we'll do something a little bit interesting. We'll search for just the number 1. And we'll want to choose a row that says static, has just the number 1, and has a G for the fact that this is already available globally. So we'll just hit the plus next to that. And this just represents that this event increments by 1 each time it happens. So we don't need, in this case, a data layer source. We just need a static value to represent that it's an incrementing event. So this is going to be true for anything that maps ultimately to an event in Adobe Analytics terms that just needs to have a count that increases. Then we'll add the variable that we want this to report into. So we'll create new, and then this maps to the actual event name that gets created in Adobe Analytics. So we might say something like virtual try-on tool use count. Increments each time the user uses the virtual try-on tools. Then we have a number of different variable types that we can map to. Again, if you're not an experienced Adobe Analytics architect, work with somebody who is to determine the most appropriate variable type. But in this case, we want this to be an event. And we have all of the settings that we would manually configure if we were doing this in the admin console. But setting them up in Apollo allows them to be documented and repeatable. So this is simply going to be a counter event, and we can choose whether or not we want participation enabled. And again, architectural decision. We'll always record the event. We'll do our polarity as positive, meaning that up is good in terms of the metrics, and we want this to be visible everywhere. Then we'll hit save and continue. We'll continue again since we've completed that step. And now we see all three parts of this are mapped. So what this says so far is when the virtual try-on tool used event is pushed, we want to count the number of virtual try-on tool uses by incrementing by one each time and passing that to an event in Adobe Analytics. Then we also want to capture the name of the virtual try-on tool used. And so we need to add a data source and a variable for this piece as well in order to fully answer the question. On the add data source here, we'll actually be mapping to a data layer location that keeps track of the tool name used that the developers will implement. So here I'll hit create new, and then I'll name this virtual try-on tool name. Then this will be a data layer data source. And then I'll type the path of the data layer that I want. The top level name, such as app event data, doesn't need to be included here since that's specified at the property level. So everything under that will specify in the data layer path. And you can take a look in the design section under data sources and see the structure that is forming around your data layer. And in this case, I don't have a top level object that describes what I'm looking to do here, so I'll create one. I'll start the data layer path with tool and then .tool name. So this will, under app event data, create a new top level node called tool, and under that we'll have tool name. I don't need to use the containing array for this, but in cases where you're using product syntax, EVARs, or anything related to merchandising in general, anything that needs to be an array, this containing array structure applies. So it's very important that the type of variable and the structure of your data layer path align. So in this case, no array, I'm just using the data layer path. And you can mouse over these informational icons to see how you would structure this if it was an array. The data source value type plays into our QA validation that occurs later. In this case, we want the tool name to be a string. And we're not going to set a maximum minimum length or regex pattern right now, but we could. If we knew that there was no tool name that would ever be over 25 characters because of some other limitation on another platform, I could type the max length of 25 characters. Or if I knew that the tool name was always a number followed by 3 words, I could represent that with a regular expression, and then we would be able to pass a console error, which could be later recorded in Airbreak to capture any time that that condition was violated. And you can see the other videos in this series on validation features in Apollo for more on Airbreak. Our last field is examples. And if we mouse over this, generally the examples are comma delimited, and they're a way for us to show the developers types of things that they might fill this in with, which can be really helpful since the name isn't always descriptive enough. So again, I'll put my examples that might be the values for this event. I'll hit save and continue. And then I've completed this section, so I'll hit save and continue again. So now I'm on to my last piece of this section. So I have a data source, which is a data layer value, and now I want to map this to an EVAR. So I'll add a variable, and I'll hit create new, and we'll call this variable virtual try-on tool name. And again, we'll select the appropriate variable type, which is EVAR in this case. Then we have the settings that we would configure in the admin console if we were doing this manually. And we want this to be a text string rather than a counter EVAR. And our allocation type will do most recent last, and our expiration will do visit. We'll save and continue. and then we'll continue again. And now we have our full setup mapped out. So it allows us to complete the process of creating a full custom business requirement with a new data layer push, a new top-level event, and new attributes. One existing data source for incrementing event, one new data source for tool name, and then creating a new Adobe Analytics event and a new Adobe Analytics eBar. Once I finish this out, I can see that it's in incomplete status. In order to actually be able to select this, I would need to mark it complete. If I wanted to save this and come back to it later, then I am able to do so. So if I search for anything that is design incomplete, then I can see this what virtual try-on tools were used most frequently, requirement available. Then I can hit view details, and then I can hit edit to get back into edit mode if there are things that I want to add or change before I set this live. If I see this in the interface, I'll note that if I mouse over it, because requirement design is not complete, I can't enable it. But once that is marked complete, I can enable it just like any other business requirement. And this configuration will make it into my documentation step and will make it into the analytics configuration.